In the harsh lands of Wyoming, a man is defined by what he owns: his land, his cattle, his reputation. It is the law of the strong. But what happens when the thing he considers property has a soul? And what happens when another man, one who owns nothing but his past, decides that soul is worth fighting for? This is a story not just of Gunsel, INGING ... but of what a soul truly costs. Jacob Thorne believed the Civil War had scoured his soul clean of any surprise. He had seen courage and cruelty to the point where they became two sides of the same worn coin. But the sight that greeted him against the splintered post of his fence that cold Wyoming dawn was something else entirely. It was not the war of soldiers, but a quiet, vicious sort of wickedness. There, in the frost-covered grass, was a heap of tangled limbs and calico, bound to the post with a coarse length of rope. A girl, no more than 16. She looked like a discarded sack. The tremor in his weathered hands was a ghost from another lifetime, a memory that 20 years of solitude on this homestead had nearly buried. Jacob knelt, his knife making short, decisive work of the hemp rope. The raw, angry welts where it had bitten into her young skin told a story he didn't want to hear. Her lips were split and bloodless from exposure, and the ice-kissed strands of her raven hair had been frosted by the morning dot as the last of the bonds fell away. The girl stirred. Her eyes flew open, not with consciousness, but with a raw, primal terror. She scrambled backward, scuttling over the frozen ground like a fox caught in a trap. "Stay back!" Her voice was a raw rasp of thirst and fear, but Jacob had already seen it. He'd seen the purposeful pattern of bruises on her arms, the instinctive way she guarded her ribs. They were signs one could only recognize if one had worn similar marks. His jaw tightened. "Easy, child," he said, his voice low and steady, keeping his distance. "No one's gonna lay another hand on you here." She watched him, her wild eyes searching the stranger's rugged face for a lie. Jacob Thorne was a big man, made bigger by 2 decades of ranch work, but something in his gray eyes must have convinced her. She didn't run. He glanced at the wagon. Ruts, deep and careless, scarring the land away from his fence line. A trip in the night, a deliberate act. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Her name was a bare whisper on the wind. "Sarah." "Sarah," Jacob repeated. "Who did this to you?" Her face became a perfect, still mask, not of someone who couldn't recall, but of someone who was forcing the memory down. The word was barely a breath, but it hit Jacob with the force of a rifle butt to the gut. Double quotes. "My papa." The word papa hung in the frozen air, heavier than any winter storm. It was a truth Jacob knew in his very bones, one that tasted of rust and despair. The 20 years he'd spent building this fortress of solitude were meant to keep out such memories. And now one stood before him, trembling in a thin calico dress. Reason told him there was one path, the safe one. The town of Redemption was half a day's ride. Sheriff Brody was a practical man, a man who valued order over justice and saw family. Disputes as a hornet's nest, best left unstirred. He would follow the letter of the law, take her testimony, and return her to her legal guardian. The law would offer a roof, but no sanctuary. Jacob looked down at the small figure huddled before him. "She needed to be able to walk," he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Can you stand?" Her nod was as fragile as a dry leaf. As she struggled to her feet, Jacob noticed how she held herself braced, as if expecting the world to strike her. At any moment, the decision was made in that silent instant. "Come on, to the cabin." But as they walked toward the log cabin, his practiced eyes caught movement. A faint, tan-colored smudge against the sharp blue of the horizon. To another man, it might be nothing. A sudden wind, a herd of antelope. But Jacob read the signs of the prairie like other men read books. 3 riders, moving with a purpose that wasn't friendly. 20 minutes, maybe less. Inside, the cabin offered little comfort, but it was a fortress against the wind. Jacob poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and set it before Sarah. "Drink," he said. Slowly. She obeyed, but her hands shook so badly the cup rattled against her teeth. A small, desperate sound in the heavy silence. He'd heard that sound before, in the dark of his own youth. "Those men coming," he said, his voice low. "They have business." "With you?" The way her body went rigid was all the answer he needed. "He's coming back for me," she whispered, her voice nearly swallowed by the silence. "Your papa?" Jacob asked, though he already knew. She swallowed, her eyes fixed on the wooden door. ... I was payment for a debt he couldn't cover." Her words came out in a trembling rush. But then he changed his mind. He said ... I wasn't worth the price, that I'd only bring shame to the man who took me. So he had tied her to his fence to die. Like faulty merchandise. Jacob felt a familiar coldness settle deep in his gut. Not fear. It was the weight of a choice that could not be unmade. "Looks to me," he said, his gaze drifting to the rifle mounted above the hearth, "like your papa made a bad trade." His words weren't a boast, they were a verdict. Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved to the hearth, his steps heavy on the floorboards. The Winchester felt familiar in his hands, a solid weight of oiled steel and worn walnut. He worked the lever, smooth, mechanical sound that cut through the tension, then checked the chamber. He turned to Sarah. The fear was still there, a tangible thing in her wide eyes, but now there was a thin sliver of something else. "You ever handle a firearm?" he asked plainly. Her shake of the head was almost imperceptible. "You're about to," he said, his tone devoid of condescension. He took an old Colt revolver from a worn box, its handle the color of aged ivory. He placed it in her hands, the coldness of the metal seeming to steady her. "Stay by the back window. Don't show yourself. And don't shoot unless I go down." The final command hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats had stopped. Jacob peered through a crack in the door. They had halted just beyond what a wise man would consider rifle range, close enough to talk, far enough to avoid a sudden bullet. 3 figures against the vast sky. The man in the center, portly with graying stubble and the sour look of a man who frequented too many saloons, had to be the stepfather. The other 2 were leaner, harder, with eyes that held no light, men who worked for coin. "Thorne!" The portly man shouted, his voice grating and entitled. "I know you've got my girl in there." Jacob took a deep, cold breath, then stepped out. Onto the porch. The Winchester rested easy in the crook of his arm, almost a part of him. "She's not your girl to have any more," Jacob called back, his voice carrying clear in the cold air. "You surrendered that right at the fence post." The stepfather's laugh was ugly. But before he could reply, one of the silent men spoke, his voice like gravel scraping on stone. "We're not here to argue titles, rancher. Silas Kane sends his compliments." The name landed like a stone in a quiet pond. Silas Kane. Every rancher, every cattleman within 100 miles knew that name. It meant power, fear, and land acquired with blood and steel, not ink. This was no longer about a runaway girl. The girl was collateral on a debt, the gunman continued, his cold eyes fixed on Jacob. Her daddy here decided to dispose of the merchandise instead of paying up. But Mr. Kane is a reasonable man. He wants what's his. He glanced at the sun, climbing higher in the sky. "You've got 1 hour to think on it. After that, we stop asking." Jacob slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the small cabin like a final judgment on the life he had known. When he turned, Sarah was right behind him, her presence nearly silent. "There's something else," she whispered, her voice urgent. Not meant for the ears outside. "Something about Kane." Jacob turned to face her and saw it in her eyes, a terror that ran deeper than the fear of death. "Say it." "He is," she took a shuddering breath, He is my real father." The words struck Jacob with the force of a physical blow. He found himself backing away, sinking involuntarily into the nearest wooden chair. The entire situation had twisted into something far uglier and more complex. "The man outside," she went on, her voice eerily flat, "Thomas. He married my mother. After Cain threw us out." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture Jacob didn't want to see. "When I turned 16, Cain decided he wanted me back. Thomas owed him money from a card game. Cain said he'd forgive the debt in exchange for me." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. He knew men like Cain. "But Thomas got scared," the girl whispered. "He was afraid Cain would find out how he'd treated me all these years. He said Cain would kill him for damaging his property." The word property hung in the still air of the cabin. Now Jacob understood, the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched. Thomas wasn't just a coward who'd abandoned a child. He was a monster. Jacob stood, walked to the window, and looked out. 3 figures still waited, arbiters for a cruel king. But he saw them through a different lens now. This wasn't just about protecting a girl from her stepfather. This was about keeping her from a father who had discarded her once, and now sought to claim her for his own twisted purposes. "Sarah," Jacob began, his voice rough with disuse for such personal talk, "there's a reason I understand what you're going through." She looked up at him, her eyes watery but focused. "When I was 15, he said, his voice flat and unemotional, "my father sold me to a man named Holloway. Payment for a gambling debt. I worked as that man's slave for 2 years before I found the courage to run." Sarah's eyes widened, recognition, understanding. She had found kin. "The scars on my back," he continued, "are from Holloway's whip. The reason I've lived alone for 20 years is because I swore I would never let another man have power over me again." Outside, a voice called out, impatient, "Time's almost up, Thorne." Jacob looked at Sarah, but for a moment, he saw himself in her terrified eyes. He had spent a lifetime running from men like Cain, like Holloway, like Thomas. But this girl couldn't run. She was 16, alone, and had nowhere to go. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. Jacob picked up the Winchester. Its weight was no longer a burden, but a purpose. "I'm thinking," he said, checking the magazine one last time, "it's time I stopped running." Jacob stepped back onto the porch, the Winchester no longer a tool but a statement. The hour was a memory. The 3 riders were already advancing, their horses' hooves drumming the hard-packed earth like war drums. "Time's up, Thorne," Thomas yelled. "Hand over the girl, and we'll ride out peaceful." "Can't do that," Jacob replied, his voice solid as rock. The hard-eyed gunman spurred his horse forward. "Then you've chosen poorly." But before any gun could be drawn, a new sound echoed from the ridge behind Jacob's cabin. Not 3 horses, but a dozen hooves thundering in unison. At least half a dozen, moving fast toward the confrontation. Thomas's face went white. He ... he wasn't supposed to come himself. Jacob's blood ran cold as he recognized the man leading the new group. Silas Cain rode as if the land itself belonged to him, flanked by gunmen whose reputations were written in blood. Cain was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and a fine coat that was an insult to the dust and grit of Wyoming. Well, Cain said, his voice deceptively calm as his horse stepped delicately around the cattle carcass Thomas's men had dragged there. "What have we here, Mr. Cain?" Thomas's voice cracked. "I can explain. I'm sure you can, Thomas. But first," Cain's pale eyes fixed on Jacob, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Thorne. I understand you have something that belongs to me." Jacob kept his rifle aimed at the original 3, but he was painfully aware of Cain's men fanning out behind him. 9-1. Impossible odds. "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Jacob said. Cain smiled, a smile with no warmth. "I'm afraid you're mistaken." You see, Thomas here owes me a considerable sum, and the collateral for that debt is currently hiding in your cabin. The girl is not collateral. She's a human being. Sarah? Kane's voice sharpened. Is that what she's calling herself now? Good. I think it's time we settled this properly. Thomas, you sniveling worm. Did you truly believe you could let my own flesh and blood perish, and I wouldn't learn of it? The words hit like a thunderclap. Kane knew. He'd always known. Thomas's horse danced nervously. She ain't worth the trouble, Mr. Kane. I was doing you a favor. Kane's gun appeared faster than a flicker of lightning. The shot echoed across the prairie, and Thomas toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. No one asked you to think, Thomas. In that moment of chaos, Jacob heard a sharp sound from the back of the cabin, the shattering of glass. Sarah was running. Find her, Kane roared. 3 of his men immediately spurred their horses around the cabin. Jacob made his choice. He launched himself from the porch as bullets chewed the wood where he had been standing. He rolled behind the water trough as lead whistled overhead. His Winchester barked twice. 1 man was thrown from his horse. Another spun to the ground. But the odds were still overwhelming. Enough! Kane's voice cut through the gunfire. I want her alive, you fools. The shooting stopped. Jacob pressed himself against the trough, calculating his chances. 7 men left, counting Kane. His rifle held 3 more rounds. One of the riders chasing Sarah returned. Boss, she's holed up in the rock formation up on the ridge. She's got a pistol. Stubborn girl, Kane muttered, just like her mother. While Kane was distracted, Jacob sprinted from the trough to the corner of the cabin, bullets chasing him across the open ground. He made it. You're only delaying the inevitable, Thorne. Kane yelled, but Jacob heard an impatience in his voice. Then Jacob saw it. Kane was pulling something from his saddlebags that made his blood turn to ice. Dynamite. Last chance, Thorne. Kane called, calmly preparing a stick of dynamite. Convince my daughter to come down from there, or I'll turn those rocks, and her with them, into dust and rubble. Jacob watched Kane's steady hands as he lit the fuse. Each movement was precise, practiced, and without hesitation. This was not a bluff. Kane would blow the mountainside apart rather than lose the girl again. You've got 1 minute to talk sense. Into her, Thorne, Kane called, the fuse on the dynamite stick burning steadily. Then I solved this problem permanently. Jacob made the hardest decision of his life. He stepped out from behind the cabin, his hands raised, his rifle on the ground. S-R-A-H. He shouted toward the rocks. Come down. Her voice rang back, clear and defiant. I'd rather die up here. No, Jacob's voice cracked with desperation. Listen to me. There's another way. The fuse on Kane's dynamite burned on. Maybe 30 seconds left. Jacob's mind raced through every possibility, every angle, every chance to save the girl who had reminded him what it meant to protect someone weaker than yourself. And then he saw it. The one thing Kane hadn't considered. Kane, Jacob yelled, his voice cutting through the wind. You throw that dynamite, and you'll never know the truth of what Thomas did to your daughter. The fuse kept burning, but Kane's eyes sharpened. What truth? Why do you think he was so eager to get rid of her? What do you think he's been doing to your own flesh and blood for the past 6 years? Jacob saw understanding dawn on Kane's face, followed by something that looked like genuine horror. The man's hand moved toward the dynamite stick, but it was too late to snuff the fuse. Jacob didn't wait. He sprinted, diving low, tackling Kane just as he tried to throw the stick safely away from the rocks. They collided in a tangle of limbs. The lit stick of dynamite flying from Kane's grasp. The explosion shook the earth, but it detonated in a harmless patch of open ground, sending a shower of dirt and debris over everyone. When the dust settled, Jacob found himself looking up the barrel of Kane's Colt, but the man's eyes were no longer on him. They were fixed on Thomas, who was crawling away through the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Thomas," Kane said, his voice deadly quiet. "Come here." What followed was swift and brutal. Thomas Garrett died knowing exactly why, and Kane's remaining men watched their boss execute a man in cold blood without flinching. But when it was over, Kane surprised everyone. He looked up toward the rocks where Sarah waited and called out. In a voice Jacob barely recognized, "Sarah, I'm sorry." The words carried across the prairie like a prayer. "I'm not coming down," Sarah shouted back. "I know," Kane replied, "and I'm not asking you to." He mounted his horse, gathering the reins, looking older than he had an hour ago. "Thorne," he said quietly, "she's not safe as long as I'm alive. Men like me don't change." He paused. "But men like you do." He reached into his coat, pulling out a thick envelope and tossing it to Jacob. "There's enough money there to take her far from here. Start over somewhere I'll never find you." "Why?" Jacob asked. Kane looked toward the rocks one last time. "Because 16 years ago, I failed to be her father. Today, you succeeded." He rode away with his men, leaving Jacob alone with the silence and the weight of an impossible gift. An hour later, Sarah came down from the rocks. They buried Thomas without ceremony and packed what little they owned. By sunset, they were riding south toward Colorado, toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine that morning. Behind them, the Wyoming prairie stretched empty and vast, holding its secrets in the gathering darkness.